Good morning. My name is Bonnie Ammons, and I'm the Executive Director of the South Carolina Rural Infrastructure Authority. I'm glad you're able to join us today. We are excited to share information about a new funding opportunity, the South Carolina Infrastructure Investment Program, which is funded by the American Rescue Plan, also known as ARPA. During the webinar today, we will provide details on this new program and how you can apply for funding to make critical infrastructure investments in your community that will have impact. It seems like we have been talking about this program for at least a year, and now we finally have the authorization to put these funds to work. And based on our conversations with you, we know you have lots of questions. So let me say that we appreciate your patience during this last few weeks, as we have been hard at work developing the procedures, forms, and guidelines you need to submit your project for consideration. For today's agenda, we will begin with an overview of the state's ARPA allocation and RIA's designated role. By the way, we know there's an alphabet soup of acronyms like ARPA that are hard to keep up with, so we're going to try to make sure that you know what acronyms stand for. Next, we will introduce you to the South Carolina Infrastructure Investment Program and the various grants that are available. We'll provide plenty of details about the grant eligibilities, grant amounts, local investment requirements, and other grant guidelines. And we have a new application form and narrative. I think you'll find the application very familiar, but a little more streamlined. Then we'll share our selection process for applications and outline the specific deadlines and timelines that you need to know. Finally, we'll give you information about the federal requirements that go along with these funds. Because this is a new program, we expect the presentation to last approximately 1.5 hours. We are delighted to have such a large number of people participating in this webinar today, but because of that, we will not be able to field questions during the webinar itself. However, we do want to address all of your questions. So here's our game plan. Following today's presentation, if you registered with us, you will receive an email that contains a copy of the PowerPoint slides, as well as a link to the webinar evaluation. The evaluation form has a place for you to list any questions we did not answer today. If you want us to get back with you directly, please include your name, email, and a phone number. We also plan to develop a frequently asked questions or FAQ document. We'll include questions received as well as a response for those questions that are not project specific and not addressed during the webinar. The FAQ will be posted on our website, and it will be updated periodically as we get additional information. We want to make sure that everyone has access to the same information. Lastly, we are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be posted to our website via a link to YouTube, no later than this Friday, July 1. As we get started with the presentation, if you get kicked off because of connectivity issues, please sign or call back in. While a good many of you have received grants from us in the past, there are still quite a few people listening to this webinar that may not be familiar with who we are. So let me give you a brief background. RIA was created by the General Assembly and has been in operation for almost 10 years. Our mission is very focused: to provide resources for strategic investments that will strengthen and modernize critical community infrastructure. Now, when we use the term infrastructure, we're referring to drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. All of these are critical to our quality of life. That's why RIA works to protect public health and the environment, as well as lay the groundwork for economic development on a statewide basis. Our agency name is a bit misleading. We started out focusing on rural communities, and we still passionately target assistance to those communities that need it most. But we also work statewide to address a variety of needs for both large and small systems, both urban and rural areas, to ensure that we're prepared for the future. We also encourage regional partnerships. We believe they offer ways to gain economies of scale and thus save money, particularly for communities that do not have adequate resources because of a small customer base. We also provide technical assistance to address long-term viability issues. We offer state grants, typically $25 million annually, and loans of $100 million annually. By the way, our loan program is currently offering interest rates of 1.5% for infrastructure projects. To date, our agency has funded 483 grant projects in every county, and 75% of projects have been located in rural or distressed areas. We've awarded over $200 million in grants and leveraged those grant dollars with an additional $544 million for infrastructure projects. We're pleased that these resources have been targeted where there has been documented need, but we recognize there is still much work to do. I once heard that if you stay in your comfort zone, you're not growing, and you can't achieve new things. Folks, we have been given the greatest opportunity to step out and do a new thing, and we are ready to go to work. We're so pleased to be a part of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make impact statewide. All of our grant staff are here with me today for this presentation. You will hear from several of these folks later during the presentation. In addition to myself, our presenters will be Liz Rosinski, our Grants Program Director, Jackie Mack, who is our Special Projects Director, as well as Senior Grants Manager for the Lower Savannah, Berkeley, Charleston, Dorchester, and Low Country regions, and Kendra Wilkerson, who handles the planning grants as well as regional efforts. But I also want to introduce you to RIA's newest grant managers and allow them to say a few words. First, we have Amanda.
Good morning. My name is Amanda Peck. I started with RIA back in March and would work with the Appalachian Cog region. I'm really looking forward to working with all the different communities and utilities in the upstate.
Virginia is next.
Good morning. My name is Virginia Wetzel, and I will be helping folks in the upper Savannah and central Midland sections of our state. I recently joined RIA, and I'm excited to be a part of this team, and I truly believe in our mission.
There's Abby.
My name is Abby Linden, and I serve the PD and Waccamaw regions. I started last December, and I'm thrilled that I joined the agency at the start of an impactful program like SKIP, and we can't wait to get these projects started.
Finally, we have Makita.
Hi, my name is Nikita Patel, and my area includes Santee, Lynch's, and Catawba regions. I enjoy helping people and am happy to be part of the RIA. I'm ready to assist our water and sewer system.
Thank you. And I think it's fair to say that we are here to help you. So please don't hesitate to give us a call. I will provide contact information before we close today. Now, if I might, I'd like to share a little information about how we got here, because this impacts you. Last year, we conducted a statewide needs assessment related to utility viability. Many of you participated in our statewide forum and provided input regarding those efforts. As part of that study, we looked at the need for infrastructure improvement across the state. Using various sources, including the EPA, DHEC, and others, we identified a 20-year need for over $15 billion to upgrade and modernize critical water and sewer infrastructure facilities across the state. And some people have said this is still an underestimate of the true need. So armed with this information, we, along with our colleagues within local government, the water sewer associations, as well as engineering groups, became a cheerleader for the new investments needed for infrastructure. About that time, lawmakers were trying to determine the best way to allocate funding from the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA. This was federal funding that became available to the state to combat the effects of COVID. We advocated that ARPA funds offered a one-time opportunity to make an investment in public health and environmental protection that would last for years to come. But perhaps more importantly, these investments could have a positive impact on the economic future of our state. The ARPA funds made available to the state through the State Fiscal Recovery Fund totaled approximately $2.5 billion. I should note that there also were substantial local fiscal recovery funds made available directly to local governments, and these funds offered another unique opportunity to leverage state and local funds for greater impact. While the funds were appropriated to address the impacts of COVID, the Act specifically called out water, sewer, and broadband as eligible activities. It was believed that such long-term investments would help increase resiliency and aid in recovery from the financial and health impacts of COVID. The governor created a task force to determine how best to use these funds. The General Assembly held a series of hearings and meetings to evaluate a variety of statewide needs. The General Assembly passed a funding bill in May that allocated $1.8 billion in ARPA dollars for 5 primary needs. $900 million was allocated to RIA for infrastructure. $453 million went to DOT for improvements to I-26. $400 million went to the Office of Regulatory Staff for broadband. $104 million for DHEC to build a new lab, and $100 million to the Office of Resilience for storm-related needs and mitigation. The $900 million allocated to RIA for infrastructure is an impressive amount of one-time money to invest in the state. Most of the funds, $783 million, are dedicated to 3 competitive grant categories: community impact, regional solutions, and viability planning. $100 million is dedicated to special economic development projects, which will be designated by the Secretary of Commerce and administered by RIA. Please note, this is not a competitive grant category. And $17 million was reserved for the RIA administration of the program. Funding for DHEC to provide additional permitting assistance and funds for the COGS to help primarily smaller communities with application and project compliance assistance. With this one-time funding infusion of $900 million, we created the South Carolina Infrastructure Investment Program, which we will also refer to as SCIP. This funding will benefit the state through impactful investments designed to strengthen critical services for residents and businesses, create more resilient communities, build the capacity to support economic development, and provide growth opportunities for the future. To direct these efforts, we established some guiding principles for allocating the dollars. First, we hope to make a transformative impact using a merit-based selection of projects. Second, we plan to leverage the investment and enhance the impact through a joint effort to fund priority infrastructure projects. We also want to do rural outreach to make sure utilities statewide have the opportunity to access these funds and make a difference in their own communities. We hope to promote cooperative solutions through incentives for consolidation and other regional projects that affect multiple utilities. And finally, there will be accountability for program management through easy to understand procedures and transparency using an open process that promotes investment statewide. The SCIP will offer 3 competitive grant opportunities. Each of the grant categories are specifically designed to offer utilities of all sizes access to these funds for projects that will have impact in their communities. Let me highlight the grant categories, and then I'll provide more details on each one. The first grant type or funding bucket would utilize the majority of funds, $683 million. These community impact grants are designed for large systems as well as small to medium-sized systems to address priority capital improvements in water, sewer, and stormwater. The second grant category is a regional solutions program with $80 million set aside for such projects. This grant is designed to incentivize new and expanding regional partnerships. Funding would be for the capital projects needed to make such partnerships feasible. The last grant category is a $20 million planning fund for the smallest systems. For those systems, we propose a viability planning grant that will help comprehensively assess system needs, prioritize the improvements needed, and evaluate various options for achieving long-term viability, including regionalization. These planning funds are designed to put such systems in a position to access future funding opportunities and to establish the best way to help them succeed. So now let me highlight the details of each grant category. As I mentioned earlier, the community impact grants will provide funding to meet a variety of capital improvement needs for systems of varying sizes. Large utilities are those serving a population of 30,000 or more. Because these systems serve the largest number of people statewide, 60% of the funds in this category, or $410 million, are dedicated to such systems. Grants of up to $10 million will be available, and a local investment of 25% of total project cost will be required. I do want to point out that it is perfectly acceptable to apply for grants of less than $10 million, and that goes for all community impact and regional solutions projects. Now, 40% of the funding that is set aside for the community impact category will be dedicated to helping small and medium-sized utilities. Those are defined as serving less than 30,000 population or any size system located in a Tier 3 and 4 county. These systems, because they serve fewer people, often don't have access to the same resources to undertake the substantial improvements needed for their systems. For this reason, a local investment of 15% of total project cost is required. Grants of up to $10 million will be available for these applicants as well. Now, systems located in Tier 3 and 4 counties will be considered with the small to medium-sized systems category for purposes of this program. So which counties does that impact? For those of you who may not be familiar with the county tier system, it is primarily used for economic development purposes and is determined annually by the South Carolina Department of Revenue. The tiers are based on per capita income and unemployment. Applicants that are located in counties designated as Tier 1 or 2 are considered more developed counties, while those designated as Tier 3 and 4 are commonly considered to be more economically distressed or least developed. So for this community impact grant, any system located in a tier 3 or 4 county will be categorized as a small to medium utility. On this map, those counties are shown as the lighter color. A 15% local investment will be required. You may be wondering, how will we make the determination of whether you are a large system or a small to medium-sized system? For drinking water systems, we will rely on the information that the systems provide to DHEC for residential customers served. For wastewater utilities, we will use the same methodology as DHEC. Service population will be determined by multiplying the number of customers by the average household size for the county based on the latest census data. For utilities with no direct customers, the combined service populations of all utility customers will be used. For combined water and sewer systems, the DHEC number for residential water customers will be used. If such systems serve a greater number of residential customers for sewer than water, that information should be documented in the application for our consideration. Similarly, if systems serve both residential and provide primary service for wholesale customers, we will only focus on the residential customers served for the definition of system size. However, that additional information and explanation may be provided in the application, and it will be considered in terms of project impact or priorities. Now, if you disagree with DHEC's customer numbers or the method that they use for the service population, we suggest that you contact Doug Kynard or Sean Clark with DHEC's Bureau of Water directly. Certainly, you are welcome to include any additional information in the application regarding the population served. The next consideration for the community impact category has to do with the type of projects that will be given consideration. The General Assembly identified 5 key priorities for these funds, and they're listed in priority order. First, regional solutions. Projects that implement solutions that impact multiple systems regardless of size. Second, water quality. Projects that address consent orders or violations or other public health or environmental impacts. Third, resilience and storm protection. Projects that help utilities prepare for storm impacts or other potential emergencies. 4, other aging infrastructure. Projects that upgrade, replace, and modernize infrastructure that has exceeded its useful life. And finally, capacity. Projects that improve service for existing residents while preparing for future opportunities. These priorities address a wide range of needs statewide and provide the ability to identify the projects that will have the greatest impact on these priorities locally. Now, for those of you worrying that your project will address one of the lower priorities, let me remind you of what typically happens in RIA's state grant program. The majority of the grants are for aging infrastructure, even though it is a lower priority. Why? Because we receive the most applications for such projects, and they demonstrate a tremendous impact on long-term needs. Similarly, capacity and economic opportunity projects typically demonstrate a significant long-term and far-reaching impact on the entire community. So we expect to be able to fund projects in all of these priority categories. Now, let's move on to the second category. Regional solutions grants are designed to encourage large and small systems or multiple smaller systems to work together through consolidations, partnerships, or agreements in order to gain economies of scale that would improve system long-term viability, as well as improve services for customers. To reiterate what I mentioned earlier, these grants are for capital projects that are necessary to make such partnerships feasible. Now, a total of $80 million is set aside for this grant category. And grants of up to $10 million will be available to help with those types of projects. And a request for less is fine too. The local investment will be 15% of total project cost. Essentially, this program has 3 priority considerations, which are listed in order of relevance. Our number 1 priority is to encourage those projects that will result in a new consolidation or operating agreement with at least one small system with viability concerns. Second, projects that will result in an expanded partnership agreement with at least one small system with viability concerns. And finally, those projects that involve other types of new or expanded consolidation or operating agreements with other systems. Now, I think it's important to note here that regional solutions is the number 1 priority in the community impact grant category. The primary difference is that projects proposed in this regional solutions program should be targeted first to helping smaller utilities with viability concerns, and second on new and expanded partnership agreements. The community impact category is more appropriate for existing regional partnerships that are proposing new or expanding facilities. And if you're a newly formulated regional partnership, you may still be able to apply. Just give us a call. Finally, the viability planning grant category. It's designed to assist those very small systems defined as serving populations of 3,300 people or less that are unable to provide the required local investment for a construction project, or to identify one specific competitive construction project for assistance. To be considered for this grant, the system must be able to outline the specific activities to be undertaken, as well as demonstrate a willingness to implement any of the specific recommendations stemming from the planning activities. Eligible activities can include a number of very useful studies, evaluations, and plans that are critical to long-term system management, including an analysis of feasible regional options. Additional activities could include system mapping, asset management plans, televising lines, smoke testing, capital improvement plans, rate studies, and other necessary analysis. Preliminary planning and design of necessary capital improvement projects is also eligible. Now, the maximum grant is $1 million, and there is no local investment requirement for this category. We've also established priorities for assistance in this grant category. First, priority consideration will be given to projects that will specifically evaluate and make recommendations related to regional consolidation or operating agreements with one or more systems. Next, we will look at system planning projects that address system-wide long-term planning needs, such as mapping, asset management plans, and capital improvement plans and rate studies. Finally, the third priority will involve those projects that are primarily designed to provide planning and preliminary design of a necessary capital improvement project. It's important to note that grant requests should be commensurate with the proposed scope of work, and projects that address 2 or more of the priorities listed for viability planning will receive greater consideration. Now that I've set the table for the types of grants you may apply for under the South Carolina Infrastructure Investment Program and the broad parameters Let me turn it over to Liz, who will provide more specific details.
Thanks, Bonnie, and good morning, everyone. Glad to be with you today to share some important information about the new SCIP grant guidelines as it relates to all of the program categories that Bonnie just went over. So let's get started. For the last several months, as we have anticipated the federal funds coming to the agency, we have touted that many aspects of the new grant program related to both application and eventually award would be similar to what we do now. And while this still remains true, it is worth pointing out the distinct differences, which you'll hear about in more detail throughout the webinar. For example, whereas we have not had federal guidelines previously, grantees funded through SCIP will need to comply with specific federal requirements. And the local investment varies from our state grant program in terms of how much that percentage is for an applicant. And as you just heard from Bonnie, the grant amount available to applicants is significantly more substantial than what we have offered in the past. Even the types of activities are new. The list now includes several components that are ineligible under our normal state grant program. The number of applications that can be submitted is also different than what many of you are accustomed to with our state program. Finally, there is a new and most importantly, streamlined application that has been developed for the program and is now available on the website for download. Of course, myself, as well as Jackie and Kendra, will spend time this morning going over all of these points in more detail, but I just wanted to give you all a sneak preview of what's to come. If you've worked with RIA before, this slide will be very familiar. It details the entities that can apply for SCIP grant funds. This includes units of local government, special purpose districts, commissions of public works, and joint municipal organizations. Of course, applicants generally must own or operate the infrastructure to be improved. However, units of local government may apply on behalf of nonprofit water and sewer systems, or if there is a situation where an eligible applicant operates another eligible entity system. The operator, if you will, could apply on behalf of the owner. It's also important to note that applicants for community impact or regional solutions grants must be able to demonstrate viability. So this slide reflects the activities that are eligible to be paid for with SCIP grant funds. This includes both construction and related non-construction costs for water, wastewater, and stormwater projects. These are all considered eligible because the ARPA legislation uses definitions in EPA's state revolving funds, drinking water, and clean water programs to determine eligibility. In addition, capacity and growth projects for drinking water improvements may also be considered eligible based on current ARPA guidance. Non-construction costs, non-construction costs, which again are considered eligible for SCIP grant funds, include engineering, property acquisition, and right-of-way. Equipment, software, and installation necessary for cybersecurity is also eligible. A quick reminder too, that planning activities other than preliminary engineering and design are eligible, but only as part of the viability planning grant. Even though the list of eligible activities has been expanded, it is important to highlight costs that will not be covered under SCIP as detailed in this slide. Ineligible activities include routine operating costs, maintenance and repairs, vehicles or non-permanent equipment, debt or interest payments, purchase agreements, impact fees, connections or service lines on private property, or in-kind labor. Additionally, construction costs incurred through a signed contract and issuance of a notice to proceed prior to SCIP grant award are not eligible for grant reimbursement. And finally, grant administration is also ineligible for skip grants. Unique to the federal ARPA legislation is the allowance of some costs that may have been expended within the last 15 months or so and prior to an award being made. Non-construction costs, again, such as preliminary engineering and design, permitting and acquisition, as well as the purchase of materials or equipment prior to a skip grant award, may be eligible for grant reimbursement if the following conditions are met. First, costs were incurred after March 3rd, 2021. The costs are directly related to the funded project. The expenditures otherwise meet the skip guidelines as well as other ARPA requirements, including federal procurement or equivalent procedures. And finally, the grantee separately identifies such costs and provides compliance documentation in the application. RIA has always encouraged applicants to participate in cost-sharing efforts related to proposed projects. We believe that best projects are those where a utility is investing in its own priority projects that are important to that community. The Governor and General Assembly also indicated the importance of leveraging state ARPA dollars with the contribution of local and other funds and made that one of the priorities. And of course, such participation maximizes skip grants and increases their impact. Expenditures of local or other funds for any project activities listed as eligible may be counted as local investment if appropriately documented. RIA will not request documentation of compliance with federal procurement requirements for non-construction or materials equipment costs that are funded solely with local investment. In addition, even though grant administration is not eligible for a skip grant, as referenced a few slides back, again, those costs also may be counted as local investment. Now that we talked about local investment, let's go over some examples to help you understand not only how it is calculated, but how the grant amount request fits into the equation. Remember, depending on some of the factors Bonnie referenced in her portion of the presentation, that included population served, your county tier, and/or the grant category, that can determine if your application may need to reflect either a 25 or 15% local investment commitment. So let's say your project cost, which again can include construction and most non-construction items, totals $5 million. If you have a 25% requirement, which is the Navy section of your slide, you must commit to at least $1.25 million. The difference between the two is what you can ask for in skip grant funds, in this case, $3.75 million. Thusly, you meet the local investment requirement. Similarly, go over to the green section of the table and see an example for a 15% requirement. Due to the lower percentage required, the applicant commits to $750,000 and can request $4.25 million. For a project of $10 million in total costs, again, you take either 25 or 15% of that $10 million to determine your local commitment. The difference between those numbers is what you can request in skip funds. And again, note that in each case, the maximum grant request does not exceed the allowable amount. But notice what happens when it does. We can see this in our 14 million project example, where the local investment automatically starts to increase because of the limit on how much an applicant can request. By multiplying the total project cost of 14 million by the amount that must be committed by the applicant to meet the 25% local investment requirement is 3.5 million. But if you subtract that amount from the total project costs, you get a difference that exceeds the allowable amount for a grant request, which is 10 million. So in this case, the applicant has to commit to the minimum local investment plus what the balance is after subtracting the potential grant award. As a result, the applicant must commit $4 million. resulting in a final local investment of 29%. And this remains true even when you have a 15% requirement. In other words, with larger projects, additional local investment beyond the minimum will be required if the difference between the total project costs and the minimum local investment exceeds $10 million. Of course, other funds contributed are considered leveraging and is part of the project selection criteria. I hope these examples address some of the questions you may have about calculating the local investment requirement. If there is uncertainty about what we are asking for, a follow-up call to a program manager once you have estimated project costs in hand may be helpful. As many of you have been working on developing projects to submit, you also may be looking at what other sources of funds can be accessed in order to serve as the local investment requirement and ultimately carry out the project. Generally, the local investment may be provided by any source of funds except as prohibited by the other funder's requirements. Based on guidance from the U.S. Treasury, SCIP grants may not be used to meet the non-federal match or cost share requirements of other federal programs other than as specifically provided for by statute. Bottom line, be sure to consult with the other funding agencies prior to submitting an application to confirm such a pairing is possible or eligible. Now, there's also an opportunity for smaller systems to access funds through RIA to assist in meeting that local investment requirement. Let me share those details. Now, before I do that, though, allow me to offer some background. If you previously received a grant from us, RIA State Grants was the program by which you were funded, one that has awarded more than $200 million for nearly 500 projects in the last 10 years. It is the program we have unveiled each July with deadlines, applications, and program guidelines. But with the allocation of $900 million in ARPA funding, we felt that we should consider some different options for making those state funds available to eligible applicants given the current climate. So the primary focus of these funds will be to contribute toward the SCIP local investment requirement. Because of this program modification, RIA will not be accepting applications this fiscal year for the regular programs as you are accustomed to. So here are the details. Utilities that serve 10,000 people or less may request up to $500,000 of RIA state grant funds to be used toward their SCIP local investment requirement. Keep in mind that the applicant should be able to demonstrate viability and ongoing investment in system capital improvement needs. This type of request must be made in the SCIP application and justified based on need, feasibility, and impact. This applicant must also complete the viability tool, which Kendra will go over in more detail later in the presentation. However, if any RIA state grant funds remain after SCIP obligations, there may be other opportunities to use these state grants to match local funds related to cost overruns on existing RIA projects when the bids come in higher than anticipated. Another possibility for use of these funds is if there is an emergency or an economic-related project that requires immediate attention. And finally, a system may need assistance through the Regional Feasibility Planning Program that was unveiled a year ago. Of course, we will communicate with you all if there are changes to the state grant program after SCIP has been obligated. So that concludes my summary of the changes being made to RIA's state grant program. So let me turn your attention back to SCIP with regards to the number of applications that can be submitted, as well as important dates and deadlines. So these next few slides address one of the most common questions we are asked. How many applications can be submitted by a single system? There is a provision for a water sewer system to submit multiple applications but there are parameters which need to be considered. To start, an applicant generally must own or operate the system. If it is a qualifying regional project, an applicant could request a grant from both regional solutions and community impact categories for that single regional project. Viability planning grants will only go to those entities that do not receive any other grants. However, one of the goals of the SCIP program is geographic diversity, meaning no more than one award per applicant per capital improvement category. Of course, a single application may include multiple components that consist of any combination of water, wastewater, or stormwater activities. However, for each project component, a separate justification, cost estimate, and other documentation as appropriate must be provided in the application. And of course, RIA reserves the right to approve or deny all or part of an application request. One thing to note, eligible applicants may apply for SCIP funds even if they have a current RIA state grant. So let's take a look at a few possible scenarios. This slide reflects the ability for a single water and/or sewer system to apply for a regional project under the Regional Solutions category and a completely different capital improvement project in the Community Impact category. Here we have an option to apply for a qualifying regional project, requesting grant funds from each of the two capital improvement categories, not to exceed the allowable amount of $10 million each. Please note too that in this example, there is still a funding gap of $10 million that the applicant would need to commit to. And I do think with this scenario, I think it's important to say again that the applicant must own or operate the infrastructure needing improvement. Multiple applications from the same applicant may be submitted for each eligible category. But remember that I mentioned that geographic diversity is a selection factor and may impact whether multiple projects can be awarded to the same entity. Again, generally a maximum of one grant award per applicant and per grant category is the goal unless demand is limited. Now, here we have an example of an applicant that is requesting viability planning funds only, because they are unable to identify or complete a capital improvement project at this time. Ideally, the outcome of a planning grant could lead to future infrastructure improvements. For one alternative to that previous slide is that an applicant may apply in the viability planning category as well as one or both of the other categories, but the viability planning application will only be considered if no other grant is awarded. A lot has been said about the hard and fast federal deadlines required of these funds. There's a December 2024 deadline to commit the funds and a December 2026 deadline to expend all funds. South Carolina is almost a year behind most states in allocating the money. So we want to give our grantees as much time as possible to carry out their projects. As you know, infrastructure projects take time to design, permit, get easements and right-of-way, and construct. And with the contractor shortages and material delays, etc., we need to get moving. And that is why we are implementing an extremely aggressive schedule. We will accept applications in September of this year and hope to make awards in the first quarter of 2023. A demonstrated ability to expend all of the funds by that December 2026 date is required for applicants in all grant categories. Now, there has been some talk about whether this federal expenditure deadline might get extended. We have no understanding that it will be extended and have no choice but to evaluate projects based on this established federal deadline. All program funds are available for obligation in the first funding round. RIA will not hold back any funds for future funding rounds if there are enough qualified projects submitted. But if necessary to obligate any remaining funds, applications will be accepted over additional funding rounds as seen on the slide and prior to the December 2024 deadline. So now that you have an understanding of the various grant guidelines, I will turn it over to Jackie, who will share information on the application itself.
Thanks, Liz. Good morning, everyone. If you have ever prepared an application for our regular state grant program in the past, you know that we strive to make the process as simple as we can while still providing the essential information necessary for an effective evaluation of the proposed project. Well, keeping with that goal, I will be presenting what we hope is a simple process for the SCIP grants. Remember, though, that these are federal funds, so some requirements are out of our control. I'm happy to present the process to you now. Similar to the RIA state grant program, the application package will contain an application form, only this application form is 2 pages instead of 4. A project narrative, as well as other required attachments. Let me go over the application form and point out key information for your awareness. This application form has been streamlined for the SCIP grants, so don't use the old RIA application. The new application can be used for all grant categories: community impact, regional solutions, or viability planning. You simply check the box for the appropriate category. If submitting the same project for both community impact and regional solutions funding, use the same application and choose both categories. In that case, the funding request can be up to $20 million, $10 million per category. However, you should submit separate applications for separate projects, except for smaller projects that are bundled together for funding. Page 1 information that I would like to point out as new or otherwise significant includes service population. This information will be verified with DHEC data based on numbers self-reported by the system. If applying on behalf of a nonprofit, give the information for the nonprofit. And provide the NPDES and PWS numbers, as these numbers will help with DHEC data and federal reporting. And lastly, list all regional participants as applicable. If applying with the same project for community impact and regional solutions, you can check both. For project benefit, provide the number of customer accounts or taps that will be directly affected, not the service population or indirect beneficiaries. For funding request and budget summary, list the amount of funding from each source broken down into construction and non-construction components and specify the other funding sources. This is where you will indicate if you are requesting RIA state funds to be used for local investment. Remember that only small systems with a service population not exceeding 10,000 are eligible to request this, and the request cannot be more than $500,000. Make sure that your non-SCIP funds make up the required percentage of total project cost based on the type of grant you are requesting. As you can see, the information is listed at the bottom of the form as a reminder of those percentages for each grant category. A reminder too that unlike the state grant program, the required local investment for the SCIP grants is a percentage of total project costs, not total construction costs. What I would like to highlight on page 2 is that the project schedule and readiness section accommodates both construction and planning projects. Be realistic about the schedule based on the time that is required to complete each activity or milestone, as this is an important component of the selection process. Provide information on all property acquisition as well as easements and rights of way needed to complete the project. This includes the expected or actual completion date and quantities. As mentioned previously, ARPA funds have to be expended by December 2026. Timelines should provide ample time for reasonably expected delays due to materials or other impediments. Cutting time on the front end, where you have more control for things such as design, permits, acquisition, and advertisement, would be smart. And for permits, we'd like to know the types such as DHEC construction, DOT encroachment, railroad, etc. Lastly, the application must be signed by the applicant's chief executive official, certifying that the information is complete and accurate, and submitted by the deadline. And I will provide more details on the submission procedures a little later. Now, there are specific attachments required for each grant category, and the requirements are slightly different for planning projects. The requirements are listed on the application instructions. However, all grant categories require you to provide a narrative addressing the need, project description, feasibility, and benefits and impacts. Let me talk a little more about what to include in the narrative. For capital improvement projects, describe the existing facilities that are proposed for improvements or upgrades and explain in details the problem that is being addressed. For viability planning projects, explain the challenges faced by the system, including financial concerns, any compliance issues, as well as staffing shortages, and include what steps have been taken in the past to help resolve the issues, including any previous efforts to find regional solutions. Provide a detailed description of the entire project, including any components paid for with non-skip funds. Describe how the project will be carried out and specify who will pay for which components of the project. If there are other entities that will help to carry out the project, be sure to explain their anticipated roles, as there may be a need for a subrecipient agreement identifying these roles if the project is funded. When addressing feasibility, identify how the project will cost-effectively solve the problem or improve conditions. Be sure to address the timeline by explaining how the project will be carried out in order to meet the December 2026 federal debt expenditure deadline, including any anticipated problems or delays. Again, the potential for cost overruns is high given the current climate, so there should be a clear plan for how that would be handled. To further address feasibility, you must describe 2 other alternatives considered in lieu of the proposed project described in the application, and explain how the proposed solution is the most cost-effective option. This requirement is for capital improvement projects, but not planning grants. Provide the rationale for requesting RIA state grant funds if applicable. And finally, address any coordination requirements related to the Dig Once efforts for broadband opportunities. And Kendra will provide details on the Dig Once policy during her presentation. In describing the benefits and impact, explain how the project addresses one or more of the priorities that Bonnie talked about earlier for the grant category. For your convenience, the priorities are also listed in the application instructions. For viability planning projects, the information provided should clearly identify how the outcome will be used to support viability. And for all projects, ensure that the information is consistent with the priorities. You may also submit other information that is relevant and will assist with evaluating the proposed project. So in addition to the narrative, there are other required attachments, including a detailed cost estimate, maps, commitment and/or award letters for non-RIA funds necessary to implement the project, certification of public ownership of easements, rights of way, or other real property acquired, as well as the results summary of the utility viability tool, which is required for those applicants requesting RIA state grant funds to supplement the local investment requirement. Now let me provide a little more details on the cost estimates and maps. For construction projects, provide a detailed cost estimate that has been prepared by an engineer within the past 12 months. Planning grants, break the budget down into the major components of the planning activities proposed. As we know, there is a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability in the current bid climate. Unfortunately, nobody knows how long that will last. For this program, we are requiring 25% contingency for construction, identified as a separate line item. It is crucial that cost estimates be reasonable in order to avoid unexpected cost overruns. And if you have concerns about your cost estimate, please explain them in the narrative so that we understand what you're thinking. The estimate should include itemized activities, quantities, and costs. Lump sum estimates should not be submitted. Now, there are some projects where lump sum line items such as mobilization or erosion control are appropriate. When it's a wastewater treatment plant, for instance, it may be okay to list major components like electrical systems or bypass pumping, but for most projects, itemized costs are expected. And include all project costs, including a breakdown of non-construction costs. A preliminary engineering report may be submitted, but it is not required. The maps that you submit with the application should identify the following: the project location and system service area with census tracts outlined, as well as the existing infrastructure and the proposed improvements. Now, it's okay to submit one map that shows all of this information or a couple of maps that combine one or two of the requirements. And the map should be legible and consistent with the narrative and cost estimate. While we encourage you to submit supporting documentation to make your case, you should submit the following attachments only if they specifically support the application narrative. Attachments include sanitary surveys or compliance inspections, notices of violations, consent orders and the corrective action plans, test results, photos, financial or viability information. So before I turn it over to Kendra to discuss the selection process, I want to go over the application submission procedures as I alluded to earlier. You must submit both hard copies and electronic copies of the application. Hard copy submission includes one original version with original wet signature on the application certification, as well as any local funding commitment letters, must be submitted along with one duplicate copy of the full application, meaning application form and all attachments. Electronic file submission includes two separate PDFs. A PDF of the application form completed but unsigned and saved in its original format. That means not printed and scanned, and a single PDF of all attachments in the requested order. Hard copies may be mailed or hand delivered at any time, but must be received no later than 5 p.m. on September 12, 2022. Electronic files may be emailed or sent on a flash drive with the hard copies. The email address, as well as our mailing or delivery address, can be found in the application instructions. And please remember that you can always contact staff with any questions or for any assistance needed. I'll now turn it over to Kendra.
Thanks, Jackie, and hello, everyone. You've heard us say that these grants are competitive, and we really mean that. We expect to get far more applications than the available funds will cover. And most of those will be for feasible projects that would benefit their communities. So let's talk about how we will identify the projects that best fit with this program. SCIP projects will be selected using our typical due diligence process of evaluating need, feasibility, and impact, with consideration of the special criteria that apply to this program. First, RIA staff will receive and review complete applications submitted by September 12th. After reviewing, we may contact some applicants for additional information or clarification. You will only hear from us at that point if we have a question, and that communication should not be taken as an indication of the eventual funding decision. Please keep in mind that we reserve the right to modify your project request as appropriate, but if we do, we will contact you about the modification to ensure that it will be feasible. Once we have sufficient information, applications will be prioritized using a point system that is based on the selection factors that were included in the state legislation authorizing the program. Those evaluations will be presented to the RIA board, which will make final award decisions. Applicants are then notified by mail. As you can see, the two factors with the most weight will be how the proposed project fits into the program's priorities, as well as the expected impact of the project. This once-in-a-generation funding is intended to be transformational, after all. Additional factors include readiness to proceed in order to meet very aggressive federal deadlines, and feasibility, by which we mean both the applicant's ability to carry out the project and the project's ability to address the identified problem. We've already mentioned geographic distribution. We want to make sure that these funds reach folks all around the state. And finally, the extent of leveraging will be considered. While all capital improvement projects have a minimum local investment requirement, additional funds contributed by an applicant amplify the impact of the grant funds. Readiness to proceed and feasibility have long been factors we consider in awarding grants, but they're particularly important with this program for two reasons. First, any funds not spent by the federal deadline will leave the state, which isn't something any of us want. And second, we're seeing more obstacles than ever to timely completion of capital improvement projects. We know that we can expect some contractor and material shortages, as well as unpredictable pricing during implementation of SCIP-funded projects. To prepare for this, applicants must outline their plan to address such possibilities, including schedule delays and costs in excess of the budget. This will be a factor in demonstrating project feasibility and ability to meet program deadlines. To the extent possible within program and federal requirements, we want to partner with you in finding inventive solutions to the issues at hand. We're already hearing some ideas that we can work with, as long as you keep a few requirements in mind. Alternate delivery methods, such as construction manager at risk, may be acceptable as long as federal procurement requirements, such as using a competitive request for proposals to solicit services, are followed. It would be acceptable to enter into a CMAR contract prior to award, but there may be federal requirements that must be added to such contracts. And a construction notice to proceed should not be issued until after a grant is awarded. If materials are procured separately from a construction contract, competitive bidding must be used. But as long as those requirements are followed, project materials bought between March 3rd, 2021 and a grant award may be eligible for reimbursement. And if materials are paid for solely with local investment funds, these procurement requirements may not apply. We always encourage use of bid alternates, as both the state and federal procurement requirements strictly limit negotiation once bids are received. Having significant alternates can be the difference between proceeding with the key elements of a project and wasting months rebidding with a revised scope, putting the grantee and the state at risk of missing federal spending deadlines. We hope to prevent many cost overruns by requiring a 25% construction contingency in project budgets, but we still want you to detail how else you plan to prevent or deal with unexpected costs. One of the key things we need you to do to help us embrace non-traditional strategies is to make sure to fully explain your plan. The application narrative is the place to do that. If you aren't sure whether your plan will fit within the program and federal requirements, get in touch before you complete your application. We're always happy to help in that way, and your question may end up in our FAQs, where it can help other potential applicants. Now, I know some of you are thinking that you've already asked these questions and didn't get an answer. And it is true that we've asked many of you to be patient as we firmed up program details. But now that general requirements have been established, we will be ready to tackle the specific scenarios you've been wondering about. We may still not have an immediate answer to every question, especially when it comes to federal requirements, but we're ready to work with you to find solutions. Even as funds are being obligated and spent, the U.S. Department of the Treasury is continuing to update guidance on federal requirements, with the latest information published this month. If any future updates require us to change our own guidance, we will get that information to you as quickly as possible. Please know that we are always advocating for policies that are clear, fair, and consistent. One strategy that we are specifically encouraging for the first time with this program is a dig once approach, in which cost savings are realized through coordination of local construction projects. Our colleagues at the Office of Regulatory Staff are administering grants for the installation of broadband infrastructure across the state, and we are working with them to identify opportunities. At the website on this slide, you will find broadband maps identifying unserved and underserved areas of the state, as well as information about funding for broadband projects. If you are proposing installation of new water or sewer pipes, please use your application narrative to address your willingness to consult with local broadband providers and the Office of Regulatory Staff, as well as the Department of Transportation and Electric Utilities, to evaluate possible coordination opportunities. The federal requirements we keep mentioning come from three main sources. First, the actual American Rescue Plan Act, which, among other things, establishes water, sewer, and stormwater infrastructure projects as eligible uses of these funds. For more specific guidance, we turn to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, which is administering the specific pot of ARPA funds that we are receiving, called the State Fiscal Recovery Funds. Treasury has a lot of information on its website regarding eligibility and compliance requirements, which apply to both SCIP and usage of any local fiscal recovery funds your organization may have access to. Finally, there is the federal uniform guidance found in 2 CFR Part 200. It's not light reading, but it covers a lot of the financial, administrative, and procurement requirements we've been referring to, among other things. Some of the specific requirements that we know will apply are listed here. Federal procurement or equivalent written procedures must be followed. This generally means using a request for qualifications or request for proposals for any services, including engineering, and competitive bidding for both materials and traditional construction contracts. Something to keep in mind is that federal procurement standards will only apply to costs that are paid for in whole or in part by grant funds, not those that are wholly paid for with other non-federal funds and are clearly delineated in a separate contract. Since all capital improvement projects will require some amount of local investment, it would be wise to allocate those non-SCIP funds to the costs for which federal procurement methods may be harder to comply with or document. Another requirement to be aware of is the need to complete a single audit if your organization spends more than $750,000 in federal funds in a single fiscal year. This type of audit must be completed by a qualified auditor. We do understand that a Davis-Bacon wage certification will be required for projects over $10 million. One thing that is not required for this program is NEPA environmental review. Although American iron and steel requirements also do not apply, we are awaiting clarification on whether the very similar Build America, Buy America provisions known as BABA will apply. We are also seeking clarification about whether the Uniform Relocation and Real Property Acquisition Policy Act will apply, and we'll let you know as soon as we find out. This slide shows some more detail about acceptable procurement methods for services such as engineering or legal. The solicitation must be publicized. We would suggest doing that on Skibo. It includes evaluation factors with some indication of their relative importance, such as points assigned to each, and requires a written submission to be evaluated by a review panel. The winning proposal is then selected based on the established factors, not necessarily based on lowest cost. For engineering services specifically, a firm can be chosen based on a request for qualifications rather than proposals, with the price negotiated once the firm is selected. For procurement of materials, as well as most construction contracts, we would expect to see traditional competitive bidding. The exception to that would be if you are using one of the alternative methods mentioned earlier. While we do expect some alternative methods, such as CMAR and design build, to be allowed, we should note that traditional competitive bidding is the federally preferred method for construction contracts. These traditional procedures are essentially the same as what we use in our regular RIA program and are probably similar to those required by your local procurement code as well. The bids must be publicly advertised, preferably on Skibo, usually for 30 days. Sealed bids have to be opened publicly, and the contract must be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Negotiation of the low bid price is extremely limited and only allowed when the low bid exceeds available funds, which is a situation we hope to avoid by planning for contingencies and alternates in advance. Also, there will be some specific federal requirements that have to be included in the contract itself. Those of you who have used SRF, USDA, or EDA funding are probably familiar with all of these federal requirements. For those of you who have not and are getting a little nervous about unfamiliar policies, please be assured that RIA staff is here to provide the information both applicants and grantees will need to comply with the rules. As I mentioned, we may not have all the answers yet, but we are working closely with the experts contracted by the state to ensure that all of these much needed funds are being properly spent, and we will share any critical updates as we get them. One way that we will share those updates is through answers to FAQs that we will periodically post to our website. Although we won't have time to take questions during this webinar, we would encourage you to write them down now in order to share them with us through the webinar evaluation form that will be emailed later today. You can also email your questions to us at any time. One thing you may be wondering about, especially if you happen to have read the state legislation on this program, is whether any of the program requirements we have outlined can be waived or modified. While we have no ability to waive federal requirements, program requirements that are based on the state legislation may be modified in some cases, subject to approval or review by the Joint Bond Review Committee. However, the input we have received from members of the General Assembly throughout this process makes it clear that the state policymakers intended to maximize local investment with this program. Accordingly, modifications of the minimum local investment requirements will only be considered for utilities that serve less than 30,000 people or are in Tier 3 or 4 counties. Also, all waiver requests must be submitted in the application as a letter from the Chief Executive Official. The letter should include the justification for the request, including the need for the waiver, as well as the impact it will have on the applicant or community if granted. Any applicants requesting to decrease the local investment requirement will also need to complete the water utility viability tool that is now available to download on RIA's website. Please note that small utilities requesting up to $500,000 in RIA state funds to be used as part of local investment do not require a waiver. This option is only open to utilities serving up to 10,000 people. Viability tool that we have mentioned is an interactive Excel file developed in conjunction with WK Dixon as part of our efforts to implement the strategies recommended as a result of the statewide water utility assessment. It walks you through entry of data about your infrastructure, organizational management, financials, and the community you serve. It then calculates a viability score and summary page, which is shown on this slide, but is intended to help utility leaders, technical assistance providers, and others identify issues that may need to be addressed to strengthen the utility's long-term viability. This summary page can be printed to PDF and included with the application as an attachment. Submission of this summary is expected for any applicants requesting RIA state grant funds to supplement local investment, in addition to those requesting local investment modifications. I might also add, other applicants may choose to include the tool results as additional supporting documentation of issues you identify in your narrative, or as an indication of your utility's ability to carry out the proposed project. Viability tool can be downloaded from our website. You will need to gather some information in order to complete it, including the last year's audited financial statements, the number of unsatisfactory DHEC compliance inspections or compliance actions that your utility has received in the last 5 years, the age of your infrastructure, and the size of your service population, which you need to complete the SCIP application anyway. We've tried to make this tool as user-friendly as possible, as it is primarily intended as a resource for utilities. However, this is the first release to the public, and hard as we may have worked on it, we know it's not perfect. So if you have any trouble using it, please let me know so that I can work with you to complete the information and get your feedback on any improvements that we can make in future updates. With that, I'll turn it back over to Bonnie to wrap things up.
Phew. We're almost done. Thank you, Kendra. You've been provided a lot of information today about the grant categories, eligibilities, as well as how to apply, and a proposed timeline for the SCIP grants. Well, throughout July and August, our plan is to proactively conduct outreach and provide technical assistance throughout the state. We've planned 4 regional meetings that are scheduled as follows, or as you see on the slide. We plan to be in Duncan-Spartanburg on July 12th, in Aiken on July 19th, Florence, July 21st, and Somerville, July 26th. Much of our staff will be in attendance at these meetings. We plan to present a summary of the SCIP grants and then answer your most pressing questions. We also hope to have time to discuss projects one-on-one with folks. Look for additional information about these meetings to be sent out to you next week. The General Assembly was intent on doing what it could to help smaller systems access this one-time funding opportunity wherever feasible. So they provided funding specifically dedicated to the 10 councils of government to assist with application preparation as well as compliance assistance for funded projects. The priority for COG assistance will be to help smaller utilities. Because of their grant experience and federal program expertise, they will be an invaluable resource to help you with project assistance and application preparation. I encourage you to contact them. They will be participating with us in the regional meetings, and in some cases, they are planning additional outreach within their own regions. And this is a good time to remind everyone that RIA's grant programs are typically state funds, and as such, do not have federal requirements. But the SCIP program is entirely funded by federal sources. And as you've heard today, there will be federal requirements. Quite frankly, the guidance on those federal requirements has been slow in coming and often changing. But here's what I want you to take away. RIA has always had a strong customer focus, and we want to continue that focus by providing the best technical assistance that we can. We consider ourselves your funding partner, and we want you to succeed. So you can count on us to provide the most information that we can as soon as it is available to us. And if we don't know, we will find an answer and get back with you. We are super excited about this new opportunity, and we have new staff to serve you better. Their areas of responsibility are shown on this map, and we encourage you to call and let us help you. Our website is the place to visit for all the latest information about SCIP. As of this morning, we've added the SCIP program strategy and the application, and it's available for you to download. We will also make a YouTube version of this webinar available on our website. In the coming months, and closer to the time when awards will be made, we will also post the implementation procedures and all associated program forms. Remember, you will receive an email with an evaluation of the webinar, which will also have a place for you to ask your most pressing questions. The responses will soon be posted on the website, and we will let everyone know when that's available. I want to thank you for your time today, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.